But I talk about Atlantis. Now, Atlantis, there's a lot of speculation. Where is Atlantis? The reality is that was discovered, and I found out myself. I'm not going to say how I found out, but back in the probably in the 1990s, I was made privy to this information that the U.S. Navy, working out of northern Australia, the submarine fleets were excavating Atlantis in the South China Sea, where it had gone under literally, and when the table of Atlantis. But the Pillars of Hercules are, you see the arrow there, that's the Sunda Strait between off of Sumatra. And that's where they entered. In the Pillars of Hercules were the two volcanoes, Krakatoa and its sister volcano, which were on both sides of that entryway. And the mariners could see this for a long distance away, hundreds of miles out to sea. They could see the glow of these pillars at night. Now you can see as the line there, the orange line, and then the orange region there is the outline of where Atlantis was, more or less. And anyway, that's just part of the story. However, the reason I'm mentioning Atlantis in this discussion is because they had technologies. And this was the title of the book, Atlantis to Tesla, the Colburn Connection. And so I'll be putting these pieces together. But basically, the technology that I basically, I'm not sure if you want to say rediscovered or discovered, you only need glass, the ability to work with glass, and then high tensile glass, which is just certain chemical properties that you put along with regular glass, and then copper, aluminum, and gold, which are all used in electronics. And so they had these abilities and also knew about the vertical electric field and discharging it. I also want to mention briefly the pyramids, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which had the golden cap. Now that wasn't there just for decoration, that was there as an electrical collector. And so my book, Atlantis to Tesla, the Colburn Connection, breaches these topics. And what Tesla was doing at his Wardenclyffe Tower and his Colorado Spring facility, he was tapping into the vertical electric field. And to do that, you needed circuitry. And there again, at Atlantis, they had what were known as seawater batteries. Because if you take two different types of metal, the electrical surface potential is different in different types of metal, and you can create an electrical circuit with just by putting those pieces of metal there. Bimetallic strips, they're called. And so at any rate, that was the voltage that then was used, and then something called in electronics a Schmidt trigger, which is very simple. It's just a contact where you close. And then the Tesla tower, which is a harmonic oscillator with a coil, copper wire wrapped in a coil. And then what he was doing at his Wardenclyffe Tower, Tesla was, I talk about this in the book, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but tapping into the vertical electric field, and then that energy that was coming down was electrical energy. So at night, if you came into Atlantis, it would look like an airport with this column with Poseidon was at the giant statue of Poseidon was in the central ring of the five-ring city of Atlantis with his pitchfork going up in the air. And that was the contact with the vertical electric field, and you would have seen these propulsion systems, which I'm going to show you in a minute, riding up and down the magnetic field of that vertical electric current that was tapping into it. So it would have looked like a light show in an airport, except instead of the planes coming in and landing on a runway, they were coming down and landing vertically and taking off vertically. Okay, so at any rate, this was the location of Atlantis. And by the way, this is a very electrically active part of the world. When NASA goes over this region with satellites or with the space station or whatever, they shut down communications because this area is so electrically active. Okay, so here's the table of contents of the book. And I just want to note a couple chapters here, talking about the world that was then the earlier world before the Great Flood, and before the antediluvian world, and Atlantis. And there's actually a great book on that topic by the old lieutenant governor of Minnesota from the 1800s. But I talk about that in the book. Atlantis before the fall. What was Atlantis like? I describe it in this book. Then the beginning of the end. What was going on in Atlantis? And we know about that from Solon's visit to Egypt, the great uncle of Aristotle, and coming back with information from the priest cults of Egypt saying that's why we have the information about Atlantis, and that they were having a war with the Greeks at the time. What we know as the Greeks lived through a great catastrophe, a worldwide catastrophe, and they were the mountain sheep herders basically who survived the Venus event. Okay, so this is part of history. It's all described in the book. It says, the night the world died, the great flood. That's an amazing chapter. It talks about the great flood. And then rising out of the ashes, what happened after these major earth-wide events. And then I talk about the next 1,000 years, the Cobran, a link to the past. And like I say, I was one of the first 3 people in the United States. I introduced the Cobran to the public in this book on, like I say, a major international radio show, and then at the UFO Congress in Laughlin, Nevada, where I had a book signing. This was the official personal release of the book. And then rising out of the ashes, the next 1,000 years, the Cobran, secret societies. Now you have to understand that a lot of the ancient knowledge was lost, and the secret societies that are still operating in the world today were seeking this information. And I happen to be a physicist in Tier 1 ranking at Los Alamos, where I visited. I was an invited speaker talking about my work. The Aerospace America Air Show, many private presentations that I gave in what I call military science to the U.S. military, and also, like I say, at Los Alamos. And the secret societies who control basically right now the world banking systems and science, and I talk about that on this show. And then the rise of modern science, Tesla, the Black Century from 1900 to 2000. I talk about that. Will man survive electric highways to the stars, which was the talk, the discussion I had, the talk I gave at the UFO Congress. And then, anyway, I'll show you some more of these things in a minute. But that's the table of contents. This is really an important book. Here's a diagram of the Earth. You can see the magnetic field lines and the electrical currents, the eastwardly moving ionospheric belts in the northern and southern hemisphere, and then the westerly moving electron belt around the equator that drive the equatorial storm systems. Here's a diagram, just a simple diagram of the vertical electric field from the ionosphere to Earth's surface. Here's a picture. This is actually from a volcano in the South China Sea near where Atlantis was at night. This is a picture at night of the volcano, just basically with electricity shooting up into the sky. And the way I view it is, it'd be like the Polynesians learned how to swim because they lived near the ocean. If you grew up in the middle of a continent and had no lakes or water around, you probably wouldn't be a very good swimmer, unless you had a pool or something nearby. But without water nearby, you would not become a natural swimmer. The same is true of electricity in the South China Sea, where it's very electrically active. And so they learned how to use this atmospheric electricity to harbor it. And here's some other examples of atmospheric electricity. Here's a tornado with a big lightning bolt coming down right beside it. Here's a hurricane on Mars, which is very interesting because they tell us that hurricanes form from warm water. Well, there's no water on Mars, let alone warm water. And there's a full-blown hurricane 5 times the size of Texas on Mars. And so anyway, I talk about that in my books also. Here's another tornado I believe this was in Iceland, coming off the top of one of the volcanic active regions there. You see the arrow pointing towards it. And then, okay, now here's what I wanted to talk about. This is one of the main points of this discussion. But looks like we have a break here. I'll be back in a couple minutes and continue this discussion. The paper is called Contained Plasma Magnetic Propulsion System and Advanced Propulsion Concept. Now this was presented at the 19th International Electric Propulsion Conference, which was a closed military meeting basically. So this is the first page. This was also republished in IEEE. And here's the list of parameters. And at the time, I was president of a small company called Satellite Technology, Inc. And this copyright is, because I published it in this journal, published by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And so anyway, this is the paper that I want to show you. Now the concept is that you have glass tubes which you run very high currents through, and then you have electrical interfaces at the end, which is noticed here. So you have a very high vacuum in the tube. So these are vacuum tubes, like a neon light, literally, but very strong. Typically quartz instead of what you might call glass. But this is a picture of the basic design. And then it is used in various applications, like this would be for docking or momentum transfer between two spacecraft and using magnetic forces. Now this is what I wanted to get to. Now this, can you imagine presenting this to these audiences in closed military meetings, and they're seeing these. So this is literally the design of how you might say flying saucers work. That's the common term. And this was developed in 1982. And this is where the first time I presented this. But there again, you would not design an electromagnetic propulsion system if you did not know about electric and magnetic fields in outer space. And so standard science, they don't know anything about it, so they're still using rockets. And there's all kinds of other novelty forms of propulsion, like spinning something in a circle using centrifugal force and trying to throw something into outer space. All of these are, you might call them novel ideas. But the real question you have to ask is, can this get us to the next star, whatever your propulsion system is? And the real problem with getting to the next star, and they're finding this out, for example, with SpaceX, with their biggest spacecraft, they have to refuel them as soon as they get out into Earth orbit. That if they want to go to Mars, they have to refuel in outer space. So you have to get rid of this idea of carrying a lot of fuel along. And that's where the non-inertial propulsion systems come in, like this one. This is not throwing something out a hot nozzle to make it go. It's using magnetic fields to push against naturally occurring magnetic fields for propulsion. And so at any rate, in those magnetic fields on Earth are in the atmosphere, above the atmosphere, in the oceans, etc. And so anyway, then in the middle of this, you can see the rotating disks that give it gyrostability. This is a diagram of the different types of forces that can be drawn from this type of propulsion system, and this explains also what they view with flying saucers. It goes up, it can go sideways, it can change directions, it can hover, etc. And so this is just, like I say, this was published in, this was officially published in 1986. And there's a video that is in closed circles. I'm not sure if it's been released, of me giving the talk at the 19th International Propulsion Conference. It was held at the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs. Here's a graph. This is called a specific impulse graph, and it's a measure of the effectiveness of a propulsion system. So you have all the various different types of propulsion systems here, and the magnetic propulsion system would be up in the region where none of these other propulsion systems can go, in the upper right-hand corner. Okay, so at any rate, that's a little bit about these propulsion systems. So I wanted to present this because there's a lot of discussion now about UFOs, etc. Let me tell you, this technology was available decades ago and understood. And so it wouldn't be surprising that some naval pilots have seen these in operation and really didn't understand what they were, because even within the ranks of the military, you have a tier level that's compartmentalized. And so the tier one level, which I was dealing with when I presented this information, is totally separate from people that fly jet airplanes. Okay, so at any rate, moving on, I want to talk now about the Kolbrin. And the reason I want to talk about this is because of the electrical nature of comets. So if comets are electrical discharges and they have the biggest electrical discharge in the solar system, then they would be very good places to operate your electromagnetic propulsion system. Very interesting. So if you were, say, entering another star system, coming in there and you see the planets and you want to slow down, you would do that next to a large comet. That would be the best braking location for electromagnetic propulsion systems. Or accelerate, if you're going to leave a solar system, the best way to get a head start, so to speak, or a good blast of propulsion is with the electrical discharge around a comet. Now I want to mention also there's a second type of propulsion system that is I call it a passive electromagnetic propulsion system, where there are no moving parts and no electrical currents in the device itself. And this is something that I talk about in one of my talks, the public talks, that you can see, the 2004 UFO Congress. It's in one of my DVDs. You can download those from my webpage. But it's riding the electrical currents between the star systems, and that's part of the electrical current system in the galaxies. Between the stars, there are electrical currents, and you can literally ride those, and I talk about that in my talk. But anyway, so I wanted to introduce the concept of comets here, but I want to do it through the eyes of the ancients. And that's what the Kolbrin is. The Kolbrin it's mistermed a Bible. It's not a Bible. It's a collection of books that were left over from the devastation from the library of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a very rich Roman businessman who brought all the metal into Rome. Basically, from the mining was done in England, so he was basically a Caucasian, Israelite, and he was working, so he brought the metal in, imported it from England, and so that's where he had the contacts with England, but supplied all of Rome with their metal. Can you imagine? He was one of the richest men in all of Rome, and he happened to be the uncle. Now this is in the Bible, don't have to believe me, this is historically accurate. He was the great uncle, he was the uncle of Mary, mother of Christ. But, so anyway, look him up, Joseph of Arimathea. But he was a very wealthy Roman businessman, and he had a vast library, which he took to Glastonbury, which was, in the early days, it was not known as Glastonbury, but he built basically a monastery there for the library. And the Kolbrin is a remnant of that. Okay, so let me read from this, and this is talking about the ancients, talking about the natural disasters. Then, with the dawning, men saw an awesome sight. There, riding on a black rolling cloud, came the destroyer, referring to the large comet. Newly released from the confines of the sky vaults, and she raged about the heavens, for it was her day of judgment. The beast with her opened up its mouth and belched forth fire and hot stones and a vile smoke. It covered the whole sky above, and the meeting place of earth and heaven could no longer be seen. In the evening, the places of the stars were changed. They rolled across the sky to new stations. Then the flood waters came. The floodgates of heaven were opened, and the foundations of the earth were broken apart. The surrounding waters poured over the land and broke upon the mountains. The storehouses of the winds burst their bolts asunder, so storms and whirlwinds were loosed to hurl themselves upon the earth. In the seething waters and howling gales, all buildings were destroyed. Trees were uprooted and mountains cast down. There was a time of great heat. Then came the bitter cold. The waves over the waters did not rise and fall, seethed and swirled. There was an awful sound above. The doom shape called the destroyer in Egypt was seen in all the lands thereabouts. In color it was bright and fiery, and appearance changing and unstable. It twisted about itself like a coil, like water bubbling into a pool from an underground supply, and then all men agree it was the most fearsome sight. It was not a great comet or loosened star, being more like a fiery body of flame. And I'm going to make some commentary about that and show you some pictures of a comet called Hale-Bopp that fits that description. It's something spiraling around another. In other words, what they're seeing is actually two comets that are in orbit around each other. Okay, this was the aspect of the doomsday called the destroyer, when it appeared in days long ago in olden times. It is thus described in the old records, few of which remained. It is said that when it appears in the heavens above, earth splits open from the heat, like a nut roasted before the fire. Then flames shoot up through the surface and leap up like fiery fiends upon black blood being the lava. The moisture inside the land is all dried up, and pastures and cultivated places are consumed in flames, and they and all the trees become white ashes. Okay, there was a strange silence, and then in the gloom it was seen that the waters had parted, leaving the passage between. Now they're talking about Egypt, if you can understand. The land had risen, but it was disturbed and trembled. The way was not straight or clear. The waters about were, if spun within a bowl, the swamp land also remained undisturbed. From the horn of the destroyer, the horn is a characteristic of comets, of the electrical nature of comets. So it says, from the horn of the destroyer came a high shrilling noise. They talk about this, the very deafening noise that comes from the electrical interaction with the upper atmosphere. Pharaoh fought against the hindmost of the slaves and prevailed over them, and then there was a great slaughter amid the sand, the swamp, and the water. The great surge of rocks and waters overwhelmed the chariots of the Egyptians, who went before the footmen. The chariot of the Pharaoh was hurled into the air as if by a mighty hand, and was crushed in the midst of the rolling waters. Now they have discovered the chariots in the Red Sea. The actual chariots, this is a real story. Men forget the days of the destroyer. Only the wise know where it went, and that it will return in its appointed hour. When ages pass, certain laws operate on the stars in the heavens. Their ways change. There is movement and restlessness. They are no longer constants, and the great light appears in the skies. Okay, so at any rate, that's from the Colburn. This is an amazing book. I highly recommend that you read it. There are other authors that have done extensive studies on this, much more than I have. Anyway, I'll be talking more about that in future episodes. And so anyway, we're going to take a short break here. I'll be back in a second discussing some other aspects of comets. Okay, now I could spend days and days, I could spend the 4 years of your college career talking about these topics in depth. But here's a picture of Halley's Comet. This is a normal looking comet. So in the Colburn, when they're talking about a comet, this is what you would normally expect to see as a comet. But here's a picture of Hale-Bopp, a large double nucleus comet. And you see how it twists around itself? That's what they're talking about. So this is a larger comet. In fact, it could have been Hale-Bopp because Hale-Bopp comes very near Earth's orbit. It did not this time through the solar system, but we know that that was about 4,500 years ago. So that would have put it in the right time frame for this event. But there are thousands of comets out there. We really don't know. It'd be very difficult to tell that. But this is what Hale-Bopp looks like, a double nucleus comet. And so it's exactly what they're talking about. And they said it doesn't look like a regular comet, but it's this twisted thing around, and it looks like it's on fire, like this massive hot thing. By the way, here's a cover of a book, and I highly recommend that you read this. One of my favorite authors, a friend of mine, Yvonne Whiteman from England, and she has these amazing analysis of the Colburn, Unlocking the Mysterious Colburn, and then various books. You can get these on Amazon. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the dynamics of a small comet here. This is a paper I wrote in the 1980s, and anyway, this is a picture of Hale-Bopp with a Swan filter, which is triply ionized oxygen, doubly ionized hydrogen in a water molecule. So this is Hale-Bopp only seeing the ionized water, and these are very high energy processes. This is not like some little snowball. Okay, now here's a diagram that I drew talking about the magnetic fields at a comet called Giacobini-Zinner, that the U.S. had a flyby with a satellite from Goddard Space Flight Center. They went by this comet, and this diagram is one of the diagrams where I describe the electromagnetic nature of comets. This is a more detailed diagram of the spacecraft. The line there you see passing through behind the nucleus of the comet, etc. So this is a Dynamics of a Small Comet, was a paper that I published. And that pretty much wraps it up for the visuals here. I just want to wrap this up by saying that the whole topic of Atlantis, Tesla, propulsion systems, non-inertial propulsion systems, electromagnetic propulsion systems, and the ways to travel into interstellar space with a passive electromagnetic propulsion system. These are the ways that you go into space. You still need heavy rockets for the heavy lifting to get that up into the initial Earth orbit. But after that, that rocket is not going to get you very far. It's certainly not going to get you to the next star. And so anyway, we've learned a lot. There's a lot known, and a lot of this is basically really not in the public domain. And like I say, this is the secret knowledge, so to speak, that the secret societies want to keep, and they have all kind of things going on, like the excavations in Antarctica, because Antarctica was a minor semi-tropical continent at one time before the pole shift. And so all of what is there is simply flash frozen in place, and they're down there excavating that, and there are places where you cannot go. It's very highly protected. But at any rate, the whole story of Atlantis with advanced technology, Egypt was a colony of Atlantis, and the technology there, like I say, the pyramid, the Great Pyramid with the golden cap, it was not a tomb. It was never meant to be a tomb for pharaohs. And what happened is that the pharaohs, like a lot of these cities, were destroyed, and then the people came back and rebuilt them and lived in them, but they were not the original designers and builders. And we're learning that now. The idea that the pharaohs built the pyramids is simply not true. But at any rate, also I want you to check out my book. This book is on Amazon. It's called The Real History of Man and Earth, Myths, Magic, and Mayhem. It's in paperback on Amazon, or it's available as an ebook on my webpage. So this is the kind of thing that I enjoy doing, is talking to the public about these topics. It's and I don't color things. I don't try and put them into nursery rhyme format. I just tell it the way it is, because the real history of Earth is very exciting, very dynamic. It's not this placid place where nothing happens and nothing happened for the past 4 billion years. No, it's a very dynamic place. And we're very lucky to have this very extended period of time of calm weather and basically not a lot coming in at us from outer space. So We'll talk to you again next week. It's been a pleasure being with you, and once again next week we'll have some other very interesting topics. I think we're going to be talking about lighter than air aircraft, and so a very interesting topic. Might be the next way you go between two countries. It is in a lighter than air aircraft. Talk to you next week. Take a second to check out the webpage, jmccanneyscience.com. The short URL is jmccsci.com. My latest release, eDVD, Eclipse the New Cosmology, goes through all of the things that you have to know to understand this radical change that is really taking place right now, and with the Big Bang simply going away overnight, something I did not expect. We knew 50 years ago that the Big Bang did not work, but finally the James Webb Telescope data is putting it to rest. Go visit the webpage jmccsci.com.